Tēnā tātou katoa ko hui mai nei raro i tēnei kaupapa o te rā. Tuatahi ka mihi atu ki a koe te whae, te rangatira. Koutou katoa no ngā hoe whā. Huri ki ngā mate o te wā, haere oki oki atu. Kia tātou anō te onga ora. Tēnā tātou. I thank you for the invitation to speak tonight, and I'm really excited to hear from my tōkana here, and we'll make a couple of comments about your presentations because I thought they were really interesting. And what I'll attempt to do is to cover two broad topics. The first will be my experience at Standing Rock, and then second, some of my observations about the UN generally and ways that it could be improved. As a starting point, I'd like to talk a little bit about my time overseas, and that really through going to a university overseas was I pushed in my thinking to a point where I'm not whakamao or afraid to voice my thoughts in a forum like this. At Auckland Law School, some of the teaching that I received there was to think in a way that's reasonable, and I think that that's a barrier to progressive and transformative thinking. So if there's any one message that I'd like to impart to you is to continue to push yourself to think beyond frameworks. Don't be afraid if people disagree with you, and these thoughts that I give you tonight are my humble opinions and mine alone, and Kate the Pai, you don't agree with it. I think Reese's point about the clash of worldviews is fundamentally at the heart of the issues that we're going to face in our future. We have a society that's premised upon the individual pursuit of money versus the Indigenous framework, and there's going to continue to be a clash there. And I agree that New Zealand is leading the way in many ways, but I think we can do more. I think New Zealand has the size, the isolation, the fact that there is a Māori in nearly every family. There's no escaping our thinking. We're a huge part of New Zealand. We have our haka, we have our language. So fundamentally, we're not going anywhere, and I believe that through our Indigenous framework, through our Indigenous thinking, we can not only change the way we relate to the land and to our environment, but just be better humans and better communities. Because I think we see in the US such a graphic example of problems with our society. We have a leader there who doesn't even believe in climate change. And this is, I believe, the biggest threat to our existence, something that we need to tackle in order for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren to have a place to live. I know I'm preaching, I'm sorry, but I firmly believe that, and it is through our Indigenous thinking, not just Māori, but we have brothers and sisters all around the world that share the same thought. That is the answer, I believe, to us being better humans. So, and that's exactly what the matua talked about, and then Brad about the practical assertion of tino rangatiratanga. I totally agree. Standing Rock is a great example of when illegal processes are exhausted, that the community gathers and tries to assert themselves in a way, regardless of the legal framework or regardless of what anyone thinks. And I think for Māori we've seen historically that that's what we turn to when law doesn't help us. Fōshu and Sibe is an example, Takaparafa. There are numerous examples I could talk about where we use direct action, where we use peaceful gatherings as a way to create a space in order to achieve change. Not always successful, but I think you're inspiring generations and you're trying to create an atmosphere that fosters new thinking, and that's what Standing Rock does, I think. If anyone has any questions too while I'm talking, please feel free to ask, and please tell me when I'm running out of time. So my journey was via Pine Ridge to Standing Rock, and here you have a few tatanka or buffalo, which are a sacred part of the Lakota people, and I had a life-changing experience to be with the Lakota and to learn from them that maybe some of the things that I thought we were doing well in New Zealand, maybe we're not doing well enough, and the key reason why I went there was to learn about sovereignty. Certainly their system isn't perfect. Much like us, there is an imposed governance structure that has displaced the traditional way of governance. So much like we see with the treaty settlement process, where some of those structures maybe aren't working, that's a similar experience there. So it was really interesting to share what is working and what isn't. So I went from an environment in Pine Ridge, working for a court that was imposed and had its issues, to Standing Rock, which was an example of a community-led process, a organic gathering that had no external controls really, and that was decided by the Indigenous communities, controlled by the Indigenous communities. There was a school, everything was done in an Indigenous way, and that was overwhelming for me to turn up as this young fella and to just experience that firsthand. There was no escaping the wairua of that place, and that it was truly a transformative gathering, because you have people like me and others from Aotearoa who've been there that are hopefully, I'm trying to bring back what we've experienced and share it with others, in the hope that it does influence us here in Aotearoa. I wanted to talk to you about whananui as well. That's a great example of what we can achieve here in Aotearoa. And going back on Te Uruwera, the Rangers, which has legal personality, it's great. And I acknowledge that achievement, and also mindful of these achievements coming within a structure which is co-management, and question whether that co-management structure is consistent with tino rangatiratanga. And do we need to push our thinking a bit further? Because certainly easy for me to sit here and say these kind of things, but I do feel that we need to continue to ask questions about why it is the government is only offering us co-management and not sovereignty. Because is it just convenience? Is there a fear of what might happen? I certainly don't believe that anything drastic is going to happen. The world hasn't stopped spinning since the awa was given legal personality, so I don't think it will stop spinning if more control and autonomy was granted to iwi. Certainly, it's going to be difficult to achieve any transformative change within a framework that's about individual property, resource exploitation, but I'm just throwing that out there. I'm kind of jumping a bit, but the other thing I wanted to mention too was that the framework of how I think about our legal framework as Indigenous peoples here is that we have an inherent sovereignty which is inherent within us, that comes from our traditional lands, our traditional mountains, our waterways, and that the treaty is an expression of our relationship with the Crown that solidifies that. And then we have international documents like UNDRIP, which are there to supplement or support some of those rights, but fundamentally our sovereignty comes from our lands, our communities, our whakapapa, and that it doesn't come from the treaty or from international law, but those are tools to help assist us in the way that we relate to the Crown and to other people around the world. And often it might be that we need to use international forums when, say, the Crown isn't going to entertain self-governance or that form of tino rangatiratanga. If that's something that people want, then maybe you go to the Permanent Forum in New York and you say something, and I think I did that earlier this year, and was taken aback by some of the feedback I received on social media that people were supportive of this. Anyway, bit of a sidetrack there. So back to Standing Rock. This is the Oshiti Shakuin, the 7th Council teepee. That was the first time that teepee had been erected since the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer was killed. So over 100 years, and I think that was symbolic that this moment, Standing Rock, was used as a time to erect that teepee. And I think the success of Standing Rock, because I was just blown away by how successful it's been to get people active, is the message. Mini Wichoni, water is life. I think universally it's a pretty easy message to get on board with. And the way that they explained that this wasn't just for this Standing Rock people, but for the people that live downstream, the millions that relied on this water source. So that, I think, was key to why it was such a successful movement, was the just simple message, water is life. And they did it in a peaceful way. So yeah, that's my whakaaro on that. One massive issue I'm sure we're aware of in international law is the lack of corporate liability, and that's fundamentally something that's going to continue. And for Indigenous peoples in our communities, we know that corporations will come in, say Puhi, or there are examples in Waitara and other places where we have large corporations who really don't have any liability in international law for what they're doing, and that's a problem. And certainly the Standing Rock was a good example of that. You rely on your relationship with your state, I guess, to try to intervene to stop that. But I've been thinking about whether something like a declaration from Indigenous nations that asserts our rights in respect of corporations is a way forward. And maybe something that the next generation of minds in here can work on or think about. But that's certainly something I've been thinking a lot of post Standing Rock, is this: how do we, maybe there's some kind of Indigenous nations hui where we talk about this common theme, which is through a lot of our struggles, is the way that we relate to corporates and they're in the business of profit and exploitation. How can we assert ourselves and our tino rangatiratanga in light of that? And I think it's through gathering and formulating some principles and making sure that every corporation that comes into your rohe is given a copy of that. Maybe there's a mediation clause in there or something like that. Of course, it won't be binding, much like UNDRIP, but it's a form of advocacy. And I think that's what the UNDRIP is generally. It's not binding on its own, but it's an important tool that you can use to remind the Crown or corporations of their obligations, and to use that as a moment to generate more attention for whatever you'd like to do. So as I talked a little bit about that idea of international law as a supplement to the treaty. So, for example, you could say that we have tino rangatiratanga, and under the UNDRIP, an expression of that is that we have our own institutions, our own lawmaking processes, and you have to respect those. Or that there is an obligation to obtain free, prior and informed consent from iwi if there is some kind of activity that's happening in that community. It's consistent with tino rangatiratanga. It's also consistent with our obligations in international law. So that's how I think of it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's there's just a couple shots. One is from the Spirit Resistance radio. So there was an actual radio that ran in the camp. And I'm there with one of the DJs, and I was just working on a statement, because when I was there I prepared short statements with other Indigenous lawyers that we tried to just respond to some of the issues and also take a proactive approach. So I wrote a statement about free, prior and informed consent as fundamental to what's happening there, and that Indigenous peoples aren't communities, but they are sovereign nations. And if you do an activity like build a pipeline, you need to treat that Indigenous iwi as a nation and obtain their consent. And next, the other photo is with Chief Arvil Looking Horse, who was a medicine man, and the carrier of the White Buffalo pipe, and a very esteemed tohunga and carrier of knowledge for those peoples. And it was just amazing to meet him and to just hear him and some of his kōrero about their struggles. But anyway, I'm a big fan of him. The gathering was, you probably heard, it was one of the biggest gatherings of Indigenous nations in the world, and I was just lucky in the right place at the right time to be able to drive there and just turn up and live in a tent for a few weeks and try help to the best I could. You had nations from all across Turtle Island and some from around the world that had come from Hawaii with their Mauna Kea action. There was a rōpū that came there specifically because some of the Indigenous nations from that area had come to support them in their time of need. So I think that's something we're going to see more of. Back here in Aotearoa, if there is something that is has a profile or is as important to us as Standing Rock, then I'm sure we'll have nations travel to come and support us and stand in solidarity. I have no doubt about that. And that's, moving forward, I think going to be key to us, is to rely on that network that we have using things like social media. It's a small world now. So you can see the message, hey bro, we need you here in New Zealand, and they'll get on the plane, I'm sure. Because it's the same stories, the same struggles everywhere. Where to from here with Standing Rock? I think that Trump is a massive issue for that community and for the world, as I've said. And I, in some ways, am just really worried, but I'm also glad you have someone like Trump who is such a visible expression of what's wrong with our world. And he's not afraid to articulate that, which I think is good, because you have people that maybe weren't as active with these kind of issues now stand up and being like, we have Trump, I need to become more involved. Friends in the US that didn't go to rallies are now rallies like the new brunch over there. So it is in some ways obviously terrible, but I do think it is the whana tuha tau that we need to really become engaged. I have a lot of, I wonder about how this will translate to us back home. We have a lot of Māori engaged with Standing Rock, but why is it that we don't have that same level of engagement in our own communities? How can we transform that, what we saw, all these people getting out there doing haka, to coming home and supporting their issues in their own communities? And I just think that's something that I've thought a lot about. I think it's sometimes difficult when you are coming up against going into your own community. Maybe you don't have respect from certain people. Maybe you're clashing with your own whanaunga over the way that you think things should be done. And that's hard, no doubt about it. Go home and try to say, hey, this is what we should do. But I do think we just need to persevere and be mindful of, that was an awesome example of tautoko. How can we continue that in our own communities? How do I do? Nearly there. Okay. So quickly about the UN. I did a statement at the Permanent Forum earlier this year, and I talked about the issues I see with the forum itself. It's an amazing place where we have Indigenous peoples that are able just to turn up and to express what they're going through in their communities, some really horrific things happening around the world. And the Permanent Forum is the only place really, besides UNDRIP, which is in Geneva, where people can go and just download and have a forum where they can be heard. Because maybe they'll be killed in their home if they were to say something like that. So I'm not trying to run it down, and I know critical thinking is my mode of operation, I'm sorry. But I had concerns with the way that the forum was structured, because you had people talking across each other. You had nations, states that would stand up and say something like, we're doing well here in New Zealand, Māori is an official language, things are going really well. And then you might have someone else, like me for example, stand up and say, well actually it's not that good. Prison, suicide, health, treaty settlement processes, raising all these issues, and then there's no response from the state, because that's the way that the forum's structured. You have these individuals standing up, and my suggestion was, well, why don't we change that and make it a kanohi to kanohi forum consistent with Indigenous peoples, maybe regional gatherings where you have Indigenous nations and states come together to talk about issues, or individual, you could have Aotearoa and some of the iwi from here have a meeting behind closed doors where they try to flesh out some of the issues they have. I understand that, but it's a very political animal, the UN, so anything like that's going to be difficult. But it was interesting that other nations from Scandinavia raised the same point, and it was just obvious to me, being there, I was just like, this isn't working. There has to be some change to the way that it's formatted, so that Indigenous peoples feel like their voice is actually being heard. So that's what I tried to say, and as I said before, going and studying overseas, that's not something I would usually do, but I felt like, hey, I'm here, I feel passionate about this, I want to say something, even though people won't agree with me, that's okay. And in fact, the response from social media was really good, and I was relieved. But so and finally I'll just talk about enforcement. Obviously UNDRIP that's the main issue I see going forward, is how do we actually enforce these articles, and I believe that through those kind of forums you can foster atmosphere that at least there's a direct conversation about that. How are you actually implementing this, and what are you doing about it, whereas now that doesn't really exist. There's just some big issues, and as I said at the start, the main thing that I would like to just encourage is to continue to push yourself in your thinking. Be creative. As Indigenous peoples, we have to be creative, because everything's stacked against us in some ways. So don't be afraid to say something that might be not accepted or thought of as unreasonable, because in New Zealand we have a culture of incremental thinking, she'll be right attitude, and I believe that we need to be better than that, and we need to be world leaders in the way that we relate to the environment and to Māori, and just as a society. I think that it'll be better for everyone. So, kia ora, thank you.
So, questions?
No questions?
Observations?
What are your thoughts on a constitution,
Yeah, that's
a
it.
written constitution here in Aotearoa, upheld by the treaty and maybe the UNDRIP?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. You have Matike Mai, is anyone
Right.
familiar with the report? From that working group, Moana and Margaret chaired. That's a really good starting point for thinking about the issues. They spent a year or two going through consultation with different marae and groups to understand what it was that they wanted in the constitution. I think that's the way that we do things. We have to talk to our own people to have the mandate, and that's something else. You know, even at the UN and stuff, I was like, I don't have the mandate to do this, but I'll just give it a go. But yeah, I think that fundamentally the treaty is our constitution, the text. The principles are something that's been interpreted by Pākehā court as a means of convenience that's consistent with maintaining parliamentary sovereignty, whereas the text is, for me, the basis of the relationship. And then expressions of that come through UNDRIP and anything else that we as a society want to uphold as some of our principles. Not tolerating racism, other things. There are many things. The rights of Papatūānuku are something I think we've talked a little bit about. In Bolivia, there's an example there where it's part of their constitution. The rights of Mother Earth. Maybe that's something we look at. Yeah.
And the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples outcome document actually for the first time talked about Mother Earth as an entity, and that was a huge step forward to achieve.
No, I think there's a lot of non-Māori that believe in that or support that idea and understand that concept and understand the threat that climate change is. So I don't think it's like a just a Māori taki. I think us as a society could embrace that idea. Yeah, that's really good.
Is there like an Indigenous UN, like forum? Like, see this great synergies and building of this network, and I think everyone's identified that Indigenous people are really leaders and at the forefront. How do we, scale that?
Do you want to go? Because I know there's like the World Indigenous Peoples, isn't there a conference? There are. I'm trying to think of an Indigenous-led gathering. Is anyone here know? There's a lot of experts in here, more knowledgeable than me. But
there was the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples.
Yes.
That actually only really came about as a result of Indigenous peoples fighting the UN and member states who actually wanted to take control.
Yeah.
But there was an interesting model that developed because the different Indigenous leaders in all the global seven regions that have been carved up said, no, we're not going to do this unless we're a partnership. We're not going to decide what we're going to talk about at the World Conference unless we do it together.
Yeah.
And that was successful and is a really interesting model to use in terms of partnership anyway.
Maybe the formal creation of a civil society which gets formal recognition from the WHO and the United Nations, so it stands alongside Doctors Without Borders and Red Cross and the Order of St John as accepted civil societies.
Right.
And gets a place at each of the fora.
Yeah, even you could have a separate conference or even at the permanent forum that there's a week set aside just for the Indigenous nations to gather and do what they want.
Ironically, you'd sit right next to Palestine and Taiwan.
Yeah.
And just further to your point, as a result of the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, one of the outcomes of that was around improving